So, I have the honor to introduce Claire Monteleoni today, who is an associate professor of computer science at UC-Boulder, which she joined in 2018 following positions at the University of Paris-Saclay, CNRS, George Washington University, and Columbia University. She completed her bachelor's in Earth and Planetary Science at Harvard, PhD and master's in computer science at MIT, and was a postdoc at UCSD. In 2011, she co-founded the International Conference on Climate Informatics, which turns 10 years old this year, and has attracted climate scientists and data scientists from 20 countries and 30 US states. In 2014, she gave one of the first, if not the first, tutorial on machine learning and climate change at the NeurIPS conference. And that brings us to today's seminar, during which she will present recent machine learning strategies to study climate change. So thank you for joining us today, and I will let you take the floor.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for the invitation. So I'll assume audio and video is good unless someone speaks up. And I'm going to focus on some of our work on climate informatics, in particular using deep unsupervised learning methods. So we study climate informatics due to the threat of climate change and the extreme events that we've been seeing, megastorms and heat waves resulting in wildfire and drought, and their effects on communities and ecosystems. And climate informatics is based on the vision that machine learning can shed light on climate change. And as Tom mentioned, we have some critical mass with this event, the Climate Informatics Conference, which started out as a workshop in 2011, really bringing all walks of data science, AI, machine learning, statistics, and data mining together with all aspects of climate science. It turns 10 this year, and we've recently, of course, had to decide to move to virtual, but please join us online in late September. And when trying to bring up these topics to the AI community, we gave a tutorial about 6 years ago at NeurIPS, one of the top meetings in that field. And we, with Arindam Banerjee, we sort of viewed this as the early days of a field such as bioinformatics, where we can only guess what the possible impacts would be. And we tried to sort of break down the problems in this way, but I just want to give sort of a wild card that there are lots of other ways that machine learning can have an impact. But certainly we identified promising work and future work that could be done in reconstructing paleoclimates, which of course has massive data sparsity over both time and space. In green are areas that my own lab has looked at. I'm going to talk today about climate downscaling primarily, but we've also had a long standing interest in using AI to robustify the projections of ensembles of climate models. Of course, every problem here is spatiotemporal in nature with non-trivial dependencies. And I'll mention at the end that we've been doing some more recent work on extreme events, which, you know, as climate scientists, you know, is also largely very uncertain. What I thought I would do today for the working group, though, is focus on some methods coming from the field of unsupervised deep learning. Along the way, in the downscaling topic, we'll see a bit on self-supervision. In the off chance that I have time to also do the avalanche detection topic, we might talk about semi-supervised learning as well, but I think we're just going to have time for downscaling in the 30-minute session. And first, because I kind of like to start with a punchline, I'm going to get a little bit technical, but for those that are familiar with vanilla or supervised deep learning, hopefully this is helpful. If not, don't worry, we're going to motivate everything conceptually via the downscaling case study. So in standard deep learning, and I don't know if WebEx allows you to see my mouse, but I'm pointing at the W subscript for this F on the first equation. Those are the network weights of any neural network. And those are what are learned from data. And the way that they're learned is that a prediction loss function that compares the network's output or prediction y hat with the true observation y, and maybe this is a scalar temperature and you just have y hat minus y squared as your loss. But more generally, you know, the y's could be vectors and you could define prediction loss that makes sense for your task. But we can kind of collapse all of deep learning into a nutshell and say, look, no matter what the architecture is, you've got some parameters to fit that what we call the network weights, and we do so by doing gradient descent on this loss function. So you specify your loss function, then we're going to do gradient descent. And then the chain rule tells us how to make our incremental updates to each network parameter in this set W. Okay, and I bring this up if you're already familiar with that framework, just to mention how simple it is to translate to an unsupervised deep learning framework. Because really, we still are going to do gradient descent on some loss function to get our network weight updates. The only difference is that now this loss function cannot depend on some what we call label y, some ground truth that is paired with our input feature vector x. And since it can't depend on an external label, all it's allowed to depend on in sort of penalizing the network's output, which in this case we'll call x hat, is the network's input. Okay, but you can think about helpful loss functions still in that setting. And then we can just do gradient descent on that to figure out the incremental updates for each network parameter in our set W. And this is to the extent that you're already familiar with the supervised learning setting. I just hope to open up a set of possibilities here, because we're often in the case where we don't have paired data of feature vectors X with desired target values Y. Maybe we just have our data X, but still we might be able to write down some meaningful loss functions. One thing that I'm not going to have time to talk about, but I think is really interesting, is if you think about how networks are often trained on batches of data points, then we can start to talk about clustering objectives, because objectives for data clustering also don't depend on some external Y, they depend on the input data. And so there's this field of deep unsupervised learning for clustering that we're really interested in my group, but I don't have time to talk about today. Instead, we're going to think sort of on the lines of, at first, we're going to think along the lines of an autoencoder, which seems to be a machine doing a very pointless, not exciting task, which is given data. So here's like a grayscale image written by a human. And so we as a human looking at it might interpret that that image is meant to be a number 2, but it's just, you know, a pixel map. We want to have a machine that would output something as similar as possible to the input. And this is a pretty useless machine. But along the way, we've learned the weights in these layers here, and we are left with sort of a compressed representation of all the data that we trained with. And the point is that we wanted to actually map our data into a different representation space that we call the latent space. And if we have a narrow bottleneck like this, of course, it'll be a lower dimensional space than the input space. So reconstructing the image was sort of a pretext task for getting an interesting latent representation of a data distribution. We call the weights down to the bottleneck layer, the weights defining the encoder network, and then decoder network getting back to having an output that's the same dimension as the input dimension. And we call the representation at the bottleneck layer the latent representation. For today, we're going to get more general, where we don't actually really have to worry specifically about doing encoding and decoding. But we'd also like to not have just a static latent representation, but a distribution over a latent space. So it might help to start thinking about a variational autoencoder where in addition to learning weights for encode and decode, we also fit some distribution over the latent space. And standard VAE, you would initialize with maybe an isotropic Gaussian, and then you would learn some other Gaussian by learning your mean and covariance matrix simultaneously. Okay, but we, and I have a lot to say on VAEs in for example, an avalanche detection task that I decided not to focus on in today's segment. But hopefully what follows will help address those in the audience who don't just want to learn a Gaussian, but really want to learn a much more informative distribution over the latent space. So the work in my group on unsupervised deep learning, we've worked on avalanche detection, which I mentioned can only be talked about if there's time at the end. And instead I've decided to focus on unsupervised deep learning for downscaling in a temperature and precipitation downscaling setting. So we're going to talk about a particular unsupervised deep learning method, but my interpretation of how it works so well is that essentially we do have some self-supervisory signal, and so I'll explain each of these pieces of machine learning jargon. And so first I wanted to credit Brian Gronke, who did this work. He just finished his master's thesis and is going off to do a PhD in a climate group in Potsdam, Germany. And also Luke, who I saw is on the call, helped with this project. And then there was a previous project over the summer on supervised learning for downscaling that was supervised by Steve Sain. Brian did a summer internship at Jupiter Intelligence. So, for this audience, probably everyone knows what downscaling is. So you have some spatiotemporal data field at a coarse resolution. You would like to have the same field but represented at a finer resolution. There's a research field called statistical downscaling, and sort of our interpretation about how these methods work, we would see them as supervised, meaning that to estimate or train these models, we need paired data. So say we have a map of temperature at coarse scale, we need the corresponding map at fine scale, and we need lots of such pairs in order to fit the models that we found in this research field. And we also saw that they were mostly providing point predictions. So what we mean by that is, given a map of data at coarse resolution, the model, after it's been estimated, can be used to then output a map of the data field at a fine resolution, but just one. So we're calling that a point prediction, as opposed to a distribution over such maps at the finer scale. So using jargon from machine learning, what we're after is something generative, meaning we want a model that could actually generate a distribution over data at the finer scale. Okay, and so Brian had a very interesting contribution, which was to consider the field of domain alignment within machine learning, and to study downscaling that way. And so we'll get to all these algorithms and jargon, but essentially we can use sort of bleeding edge deep unsupervised learning technique meant for the task of domain alignment. And in particular, we adapted the architecture called align flow, which relies on normalizing flows. For that, we used one called GLOW. And we'll get into this, but sort of the knee-jerk take-home message in my mind of why this worked so well is that there is some self-supervision. There is the data that we used provides some shared structure that allows such a method to succeed. And the self-supervisory signal is that even though we don't have any paired maps at coarse grain and fine grain, and even though the processes generating our coarse scale data and our fine grain data are actually completely different types of processes, we did have alignment in the sort of bounding grid box, the bounding latitude longitude grid box that each of the processes makes geographically explicit. So via the geographic alignment, there is likely to be some underlying shared structure, and that's my interpretation of why the method worked so well. But the punchline is that we have a generative method for downscaling, and at the end I'll share the GitHub link where you can access Brian's code. So I mentioned we had different data sets at the coarse and fine-grained resolution. So we used reanalysis data, so ERA data at 1 degree latitude and longitude grid boxes as our coarse-grained resolution. And so we did separate studies, one for temperature and one for precip. And then for our fine-grained resolution, we used WRF, which is an NWP model, and we took it at 1/8 degree latitude and longitude grid box resolutions. And so that's the right column where we have temperature on top and precipitation at the bottom. Okay, so the task from machine learning that we're going to appeal to is called domain alignment, where you just assume that you have access to IID samples from 2 different random variables, X and Y, and forget sort of the semantics that we assigned to X and Y in the original picture, where X would be a feature vector and Y is a label. Now these are just two different random variables. And we want to learn a bijection between them, F, such that given Xi, so samples that I'm going to call little xi from the marginal PDF of X, applying F will allow me to approximate the marginal distribution of Y. And then similarly, if I have samples little y from the marginal PDF of Y, applying the inverse of F to those would approximate the marginal of X. Okay, so we want to somehow learn a bijection that will align to 2 distributions. So for downscaling, we'll just let one of these variables represent our distribution over our field at coarse grain, and the other one represent the distribution at fine grain. And everything is symmetric about the models. I think the way that we illustrated in the picture that we have of the architecture, we called X the coarse grain domain and Y the fine grained, but you could have done it either way. And then so the idea with the aligned flow architecture is that we do have to assume that we have IID access to the marginals of each X and Y, and we also do need to learn the conditional distribution of each of the spaces conditional on the latent space Z. But then if we add an assumption that the 2 data spaces are conditionally independent, conditioned on this shared latent space Z, we get a more tractable way to approximate the joint probability distribution over X and Y, as shown here. And then there is the question about this latent space. So we do have to start with some prior on it, and it can be extremely simple, such as an isotropic Gaussian, as I mentioned previously, for a variational autoencoder. But unlike a VAE, we can get a much more informative distribution over that latent space by learning a normalizing flow. I'll talk about that on the next slide. But sort of the take-home message or punchline here for those that want to use this sort of architecture for domain alignment, and you might want to think about it in terms of the case study of downscaling, is that we don't need paired training examples. We are just assuming that we have IID access to sample from X and similarly from Y, but we never need paired examples. So we don't need to know, here's the corresponding fine-grained map for this coarse-grained map. We don't need that pairing. So a normalizing flow allows us to go from an extremely simple prior on a latent space, for example, a Gaussian or uniform, and then apply a series of invertible transformations, these little FIs, and compose them, where now we're just going to need to fit the parameters of these invertible transformations, but it allows us to get much more informative distributions over the latent space. This picture is from, I believe, the first paper on normalizing flows, and it's talking about a particular set of normalizing flows. This is not the one that we went with, but this should give you the idea. So this is Brian's diagram of his combined architecture. It's a bit complicated, but there's just a few things to focus on here. So the architecture is essentially that of a line flow, which came out in this year's AAAI. And it is basically learning these mappings between the domain, the input domains, and shared latent space. And the normalizing flow that we chose is called GLOW, which essentially learns invertible one-by-one convolutions. But in terms of the network parameters to fit from data, we just have to learn those parameters of the little FIs that entail the flow. So we have one flow, which is going to be we need to learn the parameters phi for this composition of those little FIs to get a bijection between one of our data spaces and the latent space. And similarly, we need to learn a bijection parameterized by this psi between Y and Z. Now, one thing to note, we're not compressing at the latent level. We're just trying to get a shared latent space that will then, as we said, in that using those variational assumptions, help us approximate the joint over our X and Y space, which are our coarse and fine-grained samples, which means that for convenience in the architecture, we just need the data representation to be the same dimension. So taking the high resolution dimension, that's the same dimension that we use for the latent resolution, which means the low resolution or the coarse grained has to be upsampled, but we do so in the least information adding way, which is basically just by looking at neighboring pixels to smooth in a value of a pixel without adding much information. So we're not aware of another unsupervised learning technique for this. So we compared to sort of the benchmark BCSD technique, which is standard for downscaling, and then a technique that came out by Banyo Medina in last year's Climate Informatics, which is a supervised CNN-based technique. When you compare an unsupervised technique to supervised techniques, you don't expect it to outperform. Typically, the ClimAlign could outperform BCSD most of the time, and usually did worse than the CNN method, but was still comparable. The CNN method can, of course, only be trained on data sets where you have pairings. So you have pairings of each of the coarse grain resolution with fine grain resolution methods. And of course, to make this comparison, since the other methods just provide point prediction, we computed these tables and other tables using ClimDex indices in an evaluation setting where we had ground truth data for point predictions, meaning there would be a paired coarse grained resolution image with fine grained resolution image. But where the method really shines, which these two methods cannot do, is using them, is using ClimAlign generatively, being able to sample from it. So here's an example where we take an ERA image, so that's a coarse grain image representing precipitation, and we input that to our model. And just to note, because we're evaluating on paired examples, the paired example in the data set is this WRF image, but that's not input to the algorithm. And the algorithm generates this predicted image on the upper right. Okay, so I was going left to right from ERA was input, top middle was the desired output, but that was not fed to the algorithm, and top right with the gray shading around it is what the algorithm output as its maximum likelihood prediction. But we can also take as many conditional samples as we want, where we condition on the ERA input image and then sample as much as we want from the latent space, allowing us to output images at the fine-grained resolution space, which is the row at the bottom. And so this might give us more of a distributional sense or some sort of more realistic spread. I also want to mention that this model can allow you to do unconditional samples, where you can just actually sample from your distribution over the latent space without any input image, and then you can generate images at coarse grain or fine grained resolution. And the method is also symmetric, so you could input an image at the top, so the upper left image is at the WRF resolution, map into your latent space, and then generate an image at the ERA resolution. But more interestingly, taking this idea of latent space interpolation from the machine learning field, we have training images from WRF at the extreme right and left of the top line. Those are the only actual training images. Then we can map them into the latent space. So we get 2 points in latent space, and then we can interpolate between them in the latent space. And then from each latent space image, we can generate images at the fine resolution and at the coarse resolution. And then in terms of a meteorological interpretation, this is giving us a fake temporal interpolation between the two images at the far left and the far right. And then in the bottom, everything here is synthetic, but could be a plausible interpolation between the two endpoints, interpolation over time. So that's all I want to say about that. And just to wrap up, we're doing other stuff around extremes that I didn't have time to talk about. So along the lines of deep unsupervised learning, we did avalanche detection. So first we did a version with supervised learning, a CNN, and then an interesting approach with a VAE, which is currently under review. We've done work using probabilistic graphical models, in particular some topic modeling approaches that would allow you to learn multiple types of extreme events that are multivariate, as opposed to, I know I'm looking for drought. You could just learn from data different types of extreme events. Hurricane track forecasting using a data fusion CNN, and then we're also working on trying to forecast active and dry spells of precipitation in Indian summer monsoon. So I will wrap up. Thank you to the people that worked on this and to the sponsors, and here's some resources.
Okay, great. Thank you, Claire. So reminder, if you have a question, use the raise your hand button, or if you have problems with your audio, you can type your question into the chat box and I'll ask it out loud for you. So we do have a couple of questions. I'll hand it over to Tom to ask them right now.
So we have a couple of questions from Amy. Does Amy have an audio problem, or Amy, would you like to unmute yourself?
Amy doesn't have an audio problem, but I need to look back at what I said because I can't remember. So you can go ahead and ask it, and I'll chime in if there's any clarification about that.
So I think Amy was wondering, Claire, what you were using for the conditional distribution of y conditional on z, so p of y given z, p of x given z, and p of z. Are you always assuming isotropic Gaussian as a prior? Is that the question, Amy?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, I didn't, I'm wondering if that's a parametric form, and if so, if it's Gaussian.
So the first one, the prior, is a Gaussian, but then by learning these invertible transformations such that we would then compose them, we can get very far away from Gaussians. That's the point of the normalizing flow. Okay, thanks.
And I think, Amy, you had two other questions about downscaling and the uncertainties.
Yeah. So the second one was the idea of downscaling is closely related to the notion of change of support in statistics. Can you comment on any connection between that idea and yours?
Yeah, I guess maybe we're reinventing the wheel in machine learning, but domain alignment is pretty similar to the idea of change of support. The only thing is that we're in the unsupervised setting, and if you have change of support and you're trying to, say, regress between some variables and some target, we would typically call that either transfer learning or just sort of like out of distribution learning. This domain alignment task is literally just trying to align two data domains where you don't have to worry about like external labels. So it might make the problem a little bit easier. But that said, I mean, the assumption here is that you have IID access to each marginal.
Right. Right. And so the last question had to do with, I'm not clear where you're getting uncertainties on your predictions, or if you are.
So what we're getting is a generative model. So if you want to evaluate that, so you could sample from it a bunch of times and then evaluate it using your favorite technique. We haven't really talked about that. We've just talked about, well, I mean, actually we did do, I mean, yeah, no, we just did RMSE, bias, and correlation, and then we studied a bunch of ClimDex indices. But these uncertainties are going to be over runs and folds of testing. So these are empirical variances.
Yeah. Right. It would be really interesting to explore the connection with the existing spatial statistics literature.
Okay.
Because I know that the deep networks have a very good track record of speed, which is not always the case with those spatial statistical modeling.
Okay.
So, I mean, this is actually the second instance in which I've encountered something like this, where there appears to be some connections between machine learning methods and underlying theory in the spatial statistics. And it would be very interesting to try to drive those two things together. I think you mentioned Steve Sain as a collaborator on this. He would certainly know. He would certainly have the background to be able to sort of help with that.
Cool.
Yeah. So just some thoughts.
Yeah. Thanks. Is this Amy Braverman?
Yes.
Oh, hi.
Hi, Claire.
All right. We have a question from Karen McKinnon. Go ahead, Karen.
Great, thanks. Yeah, great talk, Claire. Thanks a lot for it. I'm very interested in the interpretation of the latent space in terms of, especially if we can learn things about the climate system from that space. And at the end, you kind of made a brief comment about interpolating in time via the latent space. So one, it's not obvious to me that like that necessarily would be true, that like you could immediately jump from the latent space to temporal interpolation. So I was wondering, one, kind of how you got to that being a temporal interpolation. Two, if you've kind of validated that compared to, say, time series of how work evolves over time. And then three, if it's not too much, if there's kind of a connection we can actually get to how, say, weather systems are evolving in time, that we can learn somewhat from this latent space.
Cool. Yeah. So it's kind of fun seeing that when I've given talks about this work to climate scientists, at least 3 times now, they have asked about the interpretation of latent space. And usually I'm just throwing up my hands about that because it's just, trying to allow us to compute something that is going to give us a joint in the kind of non-latent space. But I like your idea of comparing to time series. The reason why I said this was temporal was simply because these 2 images at the far left and right are 2 WRF images at different times. So when we then map to the latent space and have 2 latent representations, then just interpolate between the latent representations and then apply, our forward network from latent to fine-grained and then latent to coarse-grained, we get these images as output. But we sort of on the machine learning side are a bit agnostic about the interpretations for the latent space. And I don't know that it'll be that helpful for climate, but it might. And then the other thing I always do, although now all these people are actually on the line, like Emma and Libby, is point you to sort of other techniques of sort of understanding the feature representations learned in deep models, right? So they had that abstract at AGU where they said, let's do a really silly pretext task where we look at, say, a temperature map, and the goal is to predict the year. So we have a lot of temperature maps labeled by year. We feed that to a CNN, and we get this machine that, given a temperature map, it can predict the year. But then more interestingly, we can go back and look at the architecture that was learned, at the learned features, to see what are some spatial regions that can really help me distinguish between different years. So it is true that by sort of looking under the hood of the models, we might get some interesting climate insight. For now, I'm not really sure if the latent space will add much insight, but that's the kind of thing where I would want to collaborate with climate scientists to help us interpret it. And I do like your suggestion of starting by comparing to some actual time series along WRF or ERA.
Great, thank you.
All right, we have another 5 minutes for questions. Anyone have a question?
I have a question about the loss function of ClimAlign. I'm curious. So what does the loss function look like in the end when you train the?
Oh, the loss function. So it is. Okay. This is getting a little out of scope because not everyone knows about GANs, but there's an adversarial type loss. So you kind of have actor-critic type adversarial losses, both for being able to generate fake images in the X domain and the Y domain. And then you have terms in the loss that are essentially a form of regularization, maximum likelihood type terms.
Okay.
But so I would check out the ClimAlign paper for or Brian's thesis for that.
Okay, thank you. I think we have one last question from Andrew Berner, who's asking if you can quickly touch on your avalanche work that he's curious about.
Yeah. So sort of the punchline there is this idea should be applicable for any class imbalanced problem, like rare event detection problem, where you also have a fixed limit on ground truth data. So we were working only with an actual ground truth survey of like hikers trekking in certain avalanche corridors in France from Météo France, and only with SAR imagery that was not labeled. So we were not having a human try to segment the images. There was no in between because that's a hard task for humans. And I guess so kind of the punchline is that we showed we could actually learn a VAE in an unsupervised manner, meaning that we were giving it image patches that may or may not have avalanches in it. That didn't matter. This was sort of the interesting twist, because you would think, of course, you would want to learn an autoencoder that just detects avalanches. So you would want to train it on only negative samples. But we showed that you could just train it on all the data and then use supervision only in that bottleneck where you need to tune the threshold for anomaly detection. But yeah, I don't want to, I have, of course, like 8 slides on this, so I'm happy to talk offline or maybe share a preprint if you're interested.
Okay, great. And I have another question. Let's see, from Boli. Go ahead.
Hi, this is a very interesting talk. So I wonder, so you choose the align flow to model the kind of like conditional distribution of x given z and y given z. So what makes you choose this align flow? So what's the nice thing about this compared to other architectures?
So the only other, I mean, the most pertinent other architecture would be CycleGAN, which then has to, okay, so CycleGAN uses a cycle consistency loss. This loss, instead of having to check for cycle consistency, this composition of functions, because each function is invertible, the composition is invertible by design. And also we kind of don't want to be stuck with GANs, because GANs don't actually have an explicit latent space representation. They're never learning and encoding onto latent space. They're can be extremely hard to train. So in terms of domain alignment, I mean, this is a pretty bleeding edge. You would probably be looking at CycleGAN or align flow.
Okay, I have another question. Like Z is a generative process, so you would have many ensembles of Z. So how would you interpret the uncertainty or variance in your ensembles of Z? Do you think that they represent the full uncertainty of what your downscaled variables supposed to be?
Actually, that was helpful because it jogged my memory about another issue with GANs. If you want, it's hard to evaluate the distribution generated by GANs because you assume some distribution as input to your GAN, whereas with a normalizing flow or even a VAE, you train away from your prior. So you'll have like after the normalizing flow is trained, we have some distribution over Z. So I think it is a bit more interpretable now to sample directly from the latent space and to feel that that is actually a truthful distribution mapping between your two domains. Now, there is that initial assumption, right, that the images that you had in coarse resolution and the images that you had at fine resolution were each IID from the natural distributions at that scale.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, great. I think that will wrap up the open portion of this webinar series. So Claire, thank you very much for taking the time to present, and thank you for everyone for participating. As I said earlier, recording will be shared later this week, so check out our US Collabor Working Group page and also our Twitter for the update. Coming up in August, we will have 3 data science webinars, with the next webinar on August 3rd with Jonathan Wen of University of Washington.